Cybersecurity is a booming industry, but not for good reason. Threats are ever increasing, and now attackers are targeting critical infrastructure.
The threat to actually disruption of critical services that we depend on is probably at its highest. What drives the cyber threats? Three things: politics, money, and technology.
Is it a possibility that we see another WannaCry cyber attack, but one that is fueled by AI that can become so rogue, self-learning, and destruct networks across the globe, basically be uncontrolled?
So I don't want to be super alarmist about AI in terms of, the catastrophic attack that would keep destroying networks until there's none left, but I think it's a real potential source of quite acute pain globally.
Cybercriminals are becoming increasingly sophisticated, with AI a new weapon of destruction. In a game of cat and mouse, it's never-ending business for cybersecurity companies like Cisco, Palo Alto Networks, Fortinet, Cloudflare, and Zscaler. CrowdStrike's global IT outage proved just how reliant every aspect of our lives is on digital infrastructure, and hackers are intent on exploiting it, increasingly targeting critical infrastructure, such as China's Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon disrupting American telecommunications networks. A ransomware attack shut down a major US oil and gas pipeline in 2021. And the NotPetya ransomware attack in 2017 brought shipping giant Maersk to its knees, disrupting global trade. In the year to June 2024, New Zealand's National Cybersecurity Centre disrupted more than 10 million malicious cyber events via malware-free networks, a huge increase on the previous year's 250,000 malicious events. In total, organisations lost $21.6 million, making cybersecurity a constant CapEx necessity. That brings us here to a private security operations centre in Auckland. Alistair McGibbon is the Chief Strategy Officer for CyberCX, an organisation paid to protect the private sector.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons for doing it in the private sector is you can scale in a way sometimes the government can't, and you can invest in things which is risky with the concept of a return. And I guess CyberCX, both in Australia and New Zealand, as well as the UK and the US, and our operations across 19 countries in the last year, highlight that you can do often what people thought governments would do in the private sector, and sometimes, frankly, do it better.
But do you think most people realise the frequency and damage of this? Like, to see this in real time coming through is pretty astronomical.
No, most people don't understand just how I use the phrase toxic the environment is that we operate in. Now, the vast bulk of the time that doesn't impact organisations. There are near misses like on a daily basis. But I think the general public and a lot of organisations, sadly, out there just don't know how many threats there are.
His colleague Kieran Martin is also no stranger to cyber threats, having led the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Centre during the WannaCry global ransomware attack that crippled 200,000 systems across 150 countries in 2017. Kieran is advising CyberCX as it aggressively grows its business across Five Eyes nations, including New Zealand. I wanted to understand why. Is the threat here growing, and perhaps the preparation for it falling behind? Well, thank you so much for being in New Zealand and for taking time out of your only 2-day affair in this country to spend some time with us.
Always great to be back to New Zealand. Thank you for having me, Madison.
I think it's a good place to start by assessing the cyber threat level right now. And often people think of hackers and cyber attackers as kids in a boiler room, but it's far more sophisticated than this now. Can you talk to me about the level of the cyber threat currently and the ability for these attacks to damage our economies and societies significantly?
Well, you're absolutely right. The worst meme in cybersecurity in terms of misleading people is that teenager, always a male teenager with a hood over his head with the ones and zeros in the background and so forth. There's the odd one of those, but in terms of the people you really want to worry about, they're all working for organisations, either government agencies in hostile states or in criminal gangs that are very well organised. They're run like businesses, and they tend not to be run out of law-abiding countries like New Zealand, like the UK, with strong law enforcement. They're run out of places like Russia, parts of China, parts of East Asia, parts of Africa, where the rule of law struggles or isn't applied. And these organised criminals and hacking groups that work for hostile governments have presented us with a situation where the threat to actually disruption of the critical services that we depend on is probably at its highest. We talk a lot in cybersecurity about scams, and that's what most people experience, and it's horrible. Most people hear about data breaches. Everybody gets these notifications, your data's been leaked here, there, everywhere, and so forth. So you experience scams, you hear about data breaches, but what you want to worry about in terms of national security and a really disruptive disaster is those hacks that actually take out networks, which mean they don't work properly. You see it, you've seen it in New Zealand in 2021, Waikato, where hospitals can't function properly. It wasn't as bad as some of the attacks elsewhere in the world. The impact on healthcare was relatively minor, but still people had to get on planes to Australia to get treatment. In Ireland, similar sized population in 2021, the entire system for allocating appointments across the whole state went down. It wasn't fully recovered for 3 months. Average diagnostic appointments for cancer were delayed by an average of 2.5 months. So this stuff, particularly in healthcare, can have real impact on people's lives, perhaps less dramatically, but no less damagingly. It can affect education, it can affect food logistics. At one point, the Swedish co-op was throwing away any perishable item because it couldn't sell it because the digital payment system couldn't work. And what we're worried about now, what drives the cyber threats, 3 things: politics, money, and technology. The politics of cyber are getting worse. Talk a bit more about that. China has changed. Russia, we all know, is in a very menacing space right now. The money dynamic hasn't changed, but it's very bad as it is because the business model for cyber criminals is really working to their advantage. And the tech is changing because of the way that AI can be misused to make cyber attacks more harmful.
I do want to talk to you about attribution and whether or not it's helpful given the geopolitical situation at the moment. But if we could just talk about your experience for a little bit. When you were heading up the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, you were there when the WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017 massively disrupted the NHS, the health service in the United Kingdom. Talk to me about the impact that had, and is this something that we're going to start to see more of, and is there evidence of that?
It's always interesting to reminisce about the most challenging day of your career in government, and the National Cybersecurity Centre had been fully operational for just 6 weeks. And any crisis management specialist will probably smile if they're watching, because the outbreak is at 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, just as I was heading back from London to an 80-mile trip to home, and I had to turn back. The way the information emerges was very patchy. So the NHS is both one huge organisation of about 1.5 million employees and about 11% of GDP, but it's also 48,000 small organisations. There's a small general practitioner's cottage at the end of my road where I live in a rural village. That's one of the 48,000, and then there are these huge hospitals spending millions of pounds and everything in between. So we'd had bits of concern, a few isolated incidents in parts of the NHS. So when the news started trickling in, there's 1, then there's 10, then there's more, and you realise there's something really, really difficult going on. Then it becomes clear that it's global. So often, and you get this in New Zealand, you get it in lots of other countries, but often here in New Zealand, it's who would attack us. The whole point of WannaCry was it was untargeted. In fact, it was a malicious accident. So North Korea at the time were on a rampage of stealing from banks. They had emptied nearly $100 million out of the Bank of Bangladesh. They're a country desperate for hard currency because of the sanctions, and they used cyber to steal money. And they were having another go. Unfortunately, they didn't put their A-team on this one, so they miscoded it. And when you launch cyber attacks, and you're supposed to do it sort of responsibly, you're supposed to look for a destination, and if you can't find the destination, it's supposed to stop. They didn't do that last bit, so it couldn't find a destination because it didn't exist, because they typed it wrongly. And so it just went through going into more and more networks, and all of a sudden it was in 100 different countries. In fact, Russia suffered quite badly from WannaCry. So we were looking at this going, how did this happen? Who did it? Like, well, clearly, we're hit, Russia's hit, Spain, South America's hit. What's going on here? And it also looked like cybercrime. It was disguised as cybercrime. There was a ransom note. We experimentally tried to pay it and just to see what was going on, because it was only a few $100s. Normally they're much higher, so that was a bit weird. So essentially there's an element of a little bit of panic. I think in terms of managing major cyber incidents, often the details are really unclear in the early days. I mean, that was a pretty spectacular, extreme example of that. But of course, the main thing then is this is the impact on human lives. I mean, as it happens, we were in the middle of a general election campaign in the United Kingdom, so it was even more politically sensitive than normal. But on the evening news, I remember it very well because I was on it, trying to reassure the British public that we were getting to grips with this situation. But the main news was people in dressing gowns essentially being sent home or turned away from hospitals. As it happened, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, wasn't as bad as what happened in Ireland, partly because of luck, partly because of some cyber defence skill, mostly because actually the National Health Service staff reacted heroically and just improvised and made sure that the most vulnerable people got cared for. But it was a deeply, deeply difficult and scary experience, and eventually we got on top of it.
The reason I bring this up is because you speak about how rogue a virus like this was, and you mentioned technology in your previous answer, and I wonder about the application of AI. And is it a possibility that we see another WannaCry cyber attack, but one that is fueled by AI that can become so rogue, self-learning, and destruct networks across the globe, basically be uncontrolled?
I think that I've always been worried about malicious accidents. I think they're the most damaging because they just are so indiscriminate and they catch fire or go viral so easily. So even before what we're now calling the age of AI, 6 weeks after WannaCry, there was another similar incident. The Russians have a go at Ukrainian economic systems and business transactions. They miscoded. The next thing you know, Maersk can't control its shipping fleet. Chocolate production in Cadbury's in Tasmania is shut down. And that was only 6 weeks apart. And I remember thinking at that point, this is the new normal. This stuff's going to happen all the time. Now, luckily, it kind of stopped there. I think those state actors that would tend to undertake these types of attacks, even if we don't like the regimes, they're not completely irrational. And if you just keep launching these indiscriminate attacks all over the world, then eventually, the Western Alliance, the United States and so forth, the Five Eyes, we're going to have to respond in some way. So the threat of that sort of global malicious, highly disruptive accident has been in abeyance for a while, because, if you like, of the restraint of the main cyber threats nations. With AI, I think you can overhype the AI cyber threat, and actually there's a race on, and it's a straightforward race between goodies and baddies, because AI is just maths and engineering. It doesn't have any morals, doesn't have a conscience and
Not
so
yet.
forth. Not yet. Well, we'll come to that, but at the moment, the way AI is working out in cyber attacks is simply it's making them a fair bit better, but also it's making them cheaper and easier to do. And this is the bit I worry about right now. So I think the chances of Russia making another serious mistake, they're not zero, but they're lower. But what about a new actor who just thinks, okay, I can get into the cyber business I couldn't do before because I can ask some rogue AI site, I can hire somebody who's gone rogue, I can learn it myself, and it's just much cheaper. And either they don't have the skill or the sense of responsibility, or they don't care about the risk. If you talk about potentially terrorist groups who've always struggled to develop cyber capabilities because they're too complicated for them, and you emit a signal that makes you easier to detect and all of that. If that gets easier, people who are prepared to do the most outrageous things, the most just evil things in the physical world, could launch either by accident or design an AI-enabled attack via cyberspace, which could have that same type of disruption. I don't think we're at the stage yet where one of those, if you like, cheaper actors would have the skill to develop AI that would be so autonomously thoughtful that it could just decide, right, I'm on a mission, keep developing, keep reprogramming myself, keep improving myself to knock out the whole world. But I do think it's 8 years in the past now, so memories are perhaps fading. So if you think back to CrowdStrike, which was an accident, but it was a reminder of what digital chaos looks like. And actually CrowdStrike was quite mild, partly because once New Zealand and Australia had experienced it, as the rest of the world woke up, we sort of knew what to do. But secondly, and far more importantly, because it was an accident, you had a company that knew what had happened, trying desperately to fix it. If it's malicious, you don't have that. You've absolutely the opposite. So I don't want to be super alarmist about AI in terms of, the catastrophic attack that would keep destroying networks until there's none left. But I think it's a real potential source of quite acute pain globally, because somebody we've not heard of before as a major cyber actor just says, right, AI is my ticket to the global cyber hacking campaign, and off I go, and they don't know what they're doing, or they don't care who they hit.
We know who the state-sponsored actors are. You've already mentioned a number of them. What are you seeing as their main motivation? Is it monetary or is it power, aka political? And what's their play? Are they opportunistic attackers or are they strategic about it?
One of the reasons why I say the disruptive threat is at its highest is because China has changed what it does in cyberspace. So Russia, its motives as a cyber attacker have always been political. Intimidate Ukraine, intimidate us. Do a show of strength. They did this to French TV in 2015. Take out a TV station just to show that you can, and that you could do this sort of thing in future. Ahead of the war, take out Ukrainian government payment systems, all that sort of thing. When Russia was kicked out of international sport, it hacked the International Athletics Federation, and released the sensitive doping data of non-Russian athletes to make a point. So you can see it's all political for Russia. Russia then hosts cyber criminals. They're motivated by money, but they're not directly controlled by the state. China, on the other hand, just like Chinese officials will tell you quite truthfully when you're complaining about some of their more aggressive activity, whether that's warships in the Tasman or whatever else it is, China will tell you, we've never invaded anyone. They'll also tell you, equally truthfully, that they've never conducted a disruptive cyber attack. What China's initial motivation for its massive cyber campaign was espionage for politics, so they'd know what's going on, but even more so, it was economic. It was steal other people's intellectual property, cut research costs massively. It all dates from that period in the first decade of this century when China was expanding at a hugely impressive rate economically, and stealing IP at a gargantuan scale was part of that. But that's like data breaches. The company that loses its valuable patent is, of course, outrage, but there's no disruption to the business. So China built this huge system of cyber hackers, tens of thousands of uniformed military personnel and intelligence personnel to essentially help the economy. What we've learned in the past few years, a hugely important Five Eyes guidance note about this in 2024, is that as well as doing that, because it's still doing that, China has now planted the equivalent of digital booby traps all over American critical infrastructure, and the assessment of the rest of the Five Eyes is they've probably done the same to us. So, in other words, the technical term for it is pre-positioning. So you hack into a network, they're not there to spy, they're in the wrong part of the network to spy. They're like a beachhead or a digital booby trap that you could actually blow up the network as and when you wanted to. So that means that if there is an outbreak of hostilities or an escalation in tension, China has this leverage where it could attack all sorts of different sectors. The guidance note mentioned manufacturing, education, construction, government, IT services, a whole list of sectors where they found these implants. So that is a really, really scary development. It's one of the most important developments, shifts in the cyber threat for the worst for many years.
Even you now are attributing these attacks to nations. New Zealand has had its own experience with attribution with Australia to the People's Republic of China recently about an attack on parliamentary services a few years ago. Is attribution at all helpful? Because you consider the geopolitical tensions that are escalating now, and I'm assuming it will only cause cyber threat tensions to flare. So why are we attributing? Explain to me why that's worthwhile from a Five Eyes sense, but also from a business sense.
It's a great question. I think you can look at it in two ways. One is, does it help defenders? And the other is, does it change the behavior of attackers? And often when we're talking about attribution, people focus on the latter part. Does it change the behavior of attackers, where the evidence is mixed? It's not universally bad, but it's mixed. But I would start with the first. Does it help defenders? I'm speaking of, even as a cyber realist who's often poured some cold water on the more hyped versions of the threat, I'm very worried at this point, and we're not ready for massive cyber disruption. Our defenses aren't properly in place yet to the maturity that they need to be. So how do you help people? Well, firstly, you have to tell them what's going on. If you think back to WannaCry, I was in the equivalent of this type of chair in the United Kingdom, being interviewed by a British equivalent of you in a very stressful environment when there's a general important thing about public confidence. They know their hospitals are a mess thanks to a cyber attack. I'm the person from the government who's supposed to be telling them that we're going to sort this out. When you're asked, which is a perfectly legitimate question, who's behind this, if you either say, I don't know, you look incompetent. If you say, I do know, but I'm not going to tell you, you look shifty. Now, it's right that cyber is it's right that attribution is a political decision, and there may be times that it's too politically sensitive to go ahead with it. But that public confidence point is important. The other point, even more importantly for our own defences, is that there's rich technical data in an attribution. So you say, this is the Chinese or the Iranians or whoever it is, or a criminal group, and this is technically what it looks like. Go look for it. And if you put that out as a sort of bland technical document, nobody pays attention to it. If you say that, because they sort of say that, why would we care about this? There's lots of malicious code out there, what's so special about this? So if you explain the context to them, you get much more uptake in terms of the defense. There's a really important defensive side to it. On the changing the behavior of attackers, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. What it doesn't tend to do is do any harm. China does care about attribution. It doesn't mean it always stops it, but it does sometimes dial it down. Russia doesn't care, so it has no impact on that. But at the end of the day, given the other benefits on the defensive side, there's no harm in doing it, because it can help improve defences. It's not a magic bullet by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just one little tool that can help incrementally get to grips with part of this problem.
On defences, you travel around the world with CyberCX and talk to, I'm assuming, many of CyberCX's clients. What's your take and assessment of the private sector, companies and private organisations, their A, acknowledgement, but also B, action on defending and being prepared for cyber attacks? I
think that's probably the most important thing about getting ready. I think one of the things we're realising now is that at both government, corporate, and particularly in terms of legal frameworks, we have absolutely prioritised data security, actually possibly at the expense of being able to cope with disruption. And data security is important. There are gradations of how serious a data breach is. Some of them are actually quite minor. If it's just name and email, that's not really confidential information. If it's the last 4 digits of a bank card, it's not great, but there's not a great deal you can do with that, etc. All the way through to population level healthcare records, which is pretty bad, and all the way through to, say, and this is a real example that the Americans lost, the security clearance files of everybody with the top level security clearance. So data security is important, but people, organisations, when you talk to them at board level, and they look quite understandably at their legal obligations historically have been around data security. So we need to change that. We can't take our eye off the ball on data. But one of the things about cyber, which makes it quite a complicated and difficult challenge, is so much of the risk to public good, to public safety, to the well-being of a society and economies in the private sector. Lots of the critical services, healthcare in many countries, not the UK, is largely private. Education at various levels, food is almost entirely private. Transport, etc., etc. You see how many, exactly. You see how many. You saw the blockage at Australian ports a few years ago. You see that CrowdStrike grounds airlines and so on. So. And that does cost companies money, but it does a lot more than that. So it's patchy in terms of the ability of organizations to cope with it, to plan for it. I think CrowdStrike was almost a sort of Darwinian moment where you see who's prepared to cope with the loss of a key network and who isn't. So there's that whole sort of saying, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. We do need to prepare. We also need to prepare to fail, because sometimes these things will get through, and we have to get better at coping with the loss of key networks, as well as doing everything we can to make the occurrences of those less frequent. I think one of the things that we really need to get better at, and there's a lot going on, the government here is working on a cyber strategy. Australia's just passed really quite important legislation. We're about to pass in the UK some quite important legislation. You have to give business a level playing field, because some of this stuff they have to care about commercially, and some of it they don't. It's wider public interest. And you can't really blame a company for saying, look, particularly in these tough times economically, for saying, look, I'd love to be able to do my bit for national security, but I'm not sure my competitor is going to. I can't afford to do it. So you have to think really carefully about the regulatory environment, because cybersecurity is now national security. It's actually cybersecurity at a time when we're all debating about the potential loss of the American security guarantee, and we're all talking about what's the strength of our own militaries and so on. Given this disruptive threat, and given the way the political actors are interested in using cyber as a tool of intimidation and their own power projection, cybersecurity is hard power.
How does this end? Karen, it seems like it's a game of cat and mouse, where cybersecurity companies, in the best case scenario, manage to continually detect and defend cyber attacks. But what's the worst case scenario? I don't know if you've seen the recent Robert De Niro movie 0 Day, but is like this what we're heading for?
It doesn't end, in my view, because cyber's not a primary function of, cybersecurity is not a primary function of everyday life. It's just making the stuff we do in our everyday life a bit safer, or less safe if we get it wrong. My director of operations at the National Cybersecurity Centre in Britain used to say, look, this is attritional, and our job is to have more good days than bad days, and to give the bad days the reverse. Right? And so it ends in two ways. We are ground down, it becomes part of the whole narrative of the decline of the West, because we've built our dependency on all these systems and we can't secure them, so they're a big Achilles heel and so forth, and that's the disastrous scenario. The public start to lose confidence in technology. Governments and societies and companies bet on AI to rescue us from the era of low productivity and low economic growth, and it all goes horribly wrong because we don't do it safely. So there's a sort of decline bit of this where cybersecurity is really a real contributory part of a dark period in our histories. So that's the gloomy version. The optimistic version, and there is a real case for this optimistic version, but it's not going to happen passively. We have to get out and do it. Works something like follows. First of all, we really understand this disruptive risk, and we say, look, data's still important, but we've got to make these systems more resilient, and we've got to get better at it, just as they are now, never mind what they're going to be like in the future. In the banks, which are actually quite good, banking is a pretty good sector for this stuff, energy, which isn't across the world, telcos, which is somewhere in between, water, which is a bit of a worry. We've got to get better. The second thing to do, and this is the real prize, is making the newer technology safer. So there's a really famous saying in the circles that I would move in, which is the internet was not built with security in mind. When the internet was built in the 90s, when it was scaled up in the 90s, it was right, connectivity, everybody needs to be able to communicate with everybody else as quickly as possible, and nobody thought about security. Now, with new tech coming in, IoT, 10 years ago, people were saying IoT is going to be a security disaster. Actually, we started to think about IoT, and we started to say, no, you can't have default passwords on CCTV cameras or Apple Watches or whatever by law. And actually, IoT has not been a security disaster. So when we're thinking about using AI and developing AI models, we have to put security at the core, because then it gets safer for the user. And the higher up the food chain or the tech stack, you can put this responsibility on the big giants to say, look, no, you can't be putting out products full of software holes anymore. No, the hardware has to be better. The companies have to use the most up-to-date hardware and software. Then we're safer, and then we're winning.
It's amazing that you managed to stay so positive and optimistic among this threat, but I really appreciate you giving us the full download on how the stuff operates.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching Markets with Madison. If you enjoyed this interview, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. I do all of the research for these episodes myself, so your support means a lot. I always love to hear your feedback and ideas, so please drop any thoughts in the comments below. Now go put your money to work.